On February 25th, 2026, a Russian fiber-optic first-person view drone reached the outskirts of Kharkiv city for the very first time. Not the outskirts of Vovchansk, not the fields north of the border villages, the outskirts of Kharkiv city itself, Ukraine's second-largest urban center, home to over 1 million people, a city that Ukraine's allies celebrated as saved when Russia failed to take it in the opening weeks of the full-scale invasion back in February 2022. That drone reaching Kharkiv's outskirts was not an accident. It was not a stray. It was the product of 2 years of patient, grinding, systematic Russian military effort to push Ukrainian defensive lines back from the border, kilometer by kilometer, settlement by settlement, until the guns were close enough to make life in Ukraine's second city impossible. And what has happened in the weeks and months that followed that February milestone reveals a campaign so relentless, so methodically violent, and so strategically coherent that the word unstoppable is not hyperbole. It is a military assessment, because in the next few minutes you are going to understand exactly what Russia has done to Kharkiv and its surrounding region, why the front line has been permanently redrawn in ways that change everything about this war, what the slaughter being carried out against Ukrainian civilians and defenders in this region tells you about what Russia actually wants, and why the answer to the question of whether this advance can be stopped is one that no one in Kyiv or any NATO capital has been able to answer with confidence. To understand what is happening to Kharkiv right now, you need to understand what Russia built to make it possible. In early 2024, the Russian military created an entirely new formation dedicated specifically to the northeastern front and named it the North Troop Grouping. This was not a rebranding of existing forces. It was a purpose-built command structure with its own units, its own logistics chains, its own air support coordination, and its own singular mission: push Ukrainian forces back from Russia's border with Kharkiv Oblast, establish a buffer zone deep inside Ukrainian territory, and bring Kharkiv city within range of Russian tube artillery. The formation was given resources, it was given time to prepare, and on May 9th, 2024, it crossed the border into Ukraine's Kharkiv Oblast under the cover of darkness, with armored vehicles breaching Ukrainian defensive positions near Vovchansk at 5 in the morning and guided aerial bombs falling on Ukrainian lines simultaneously. The opening assault was violent, coordinated, and designed to achieve tactical shock before Ukrainian forces could reinforce the positions being hit. And from that moment forward, the North Grouping never fully stopped. By January 2026, Colonel Viktor Trehubov, the Ukrainian Joint Forces Task Force spokesperson, described what the North Grouping was doing with unusual precision. He said Russian forces were no longer conducting the large-scale offensives of 2023 and 2024. Instead, they had shifted to a constant accumulation of small fire teams probing Ukrainian defensive lines, testing for weak points, retreating when resistance was strong, then surging again when a different point showed vulnerability. Up to 15 or 16 attacks per day in the northern Kharkiv direction alone, the spokesperson of a Ukrainian brigade confirmed to journalists. 15 to 16 attacks per day, every day, in a single direction. The weight of that number is difficult to convey in the abstract. It means Ukrainian commanders in northern Kharkiv Oblast were making decisions about where to reinforce, where to pull back, and where to hold at a pace that left no margin for error and no opportunity for rest. And it was taking a toll that the frontline maps confirm with cold objectivity. On April 8, 2026, Ukrainian officials confirmed publicly what military analysts had been documenting for weeks. Russia had launched what they described as a major, sustained offensive in the Kharkiv region, a full-scale offensive focused on breaching Ukrainian defenses and establishing a permanent buffer zone along the border. Kharkiv Oblast Governor Oleg Sinigubov confirmed that the enemy's objective was explicitly to break through Ukrainian defensive lines and announced mandatory evacuation orders for residents of several frontline communities, including Vovchansk and Kupiansk. The Ukrainian State Emergency Service began moving civilians, primarily women, children, and elderly residents, away from communities in the direct path of Russian advances. These were not precautionary evacuations. These were evacuations ordered because Russian forces were actively assaulting the areas being evacuated. The people leaving Vovchansk and the villages around it were leaving because the Russian military was arriving. The town of Vovchansk is the most documented symbol of what this offensive has meant for the people caught inside it. Russia first attacked Vovchansk in the opening days of the May 2024 offensive, crossing the border and attempting to encircle it from multiple directions, combining aerial assaults with infantry attacks on its outer defenses. Ukrainian forces held, Russia attacked again, Ukrainian forces held again. But the cost of each defense was measured in destroyed buildings, depleted ammunition, wounded soldiers, and the steady reduction of a functioning town to rubble. By November 2024, the deep state OSINT monitoring group reported Russian advances inside Vovchansk, while Ukrainian forces continued defending the city block by block. Putin himself claimed during a press conference that Russian forces had captured Vovchansk entirely. Ukrainian forces denied it and said they continued defending positions inside the city. The truth visible in geolocated footage was somewhere between those claims. Parts of the city were under Russian pressure or control. Parts were still defended. The entire place had been destroyed. Apartment buildings, healthcare facilities, shops, roads, infrastructure, everything that made Vovchansk a place where people lived, rather than simply a coordinate on a military map, had been obliterated by more than a year of sustained combat. By April 2026, the North grouping was using new tactics that reflected lessons learned from 2 years of fighting in northern Kharkiv Oblast. On April 25th, the Ukrainian 16th Army Corps operating in northern Kharkiv Oblast reported that elements of the Russian 127th Motorized Rifle Regiment had conducted a motorized assault toward Vovchansk Kupiansk, using dried-out roads to attempt to move rapidly through what Ukrainian commanders called the kill zone, an isolated frontline area of elevated drone strike risk. The tactic was a direct response to Ukraine's drone dominance in the frontline gray zone, which had expanded to as much as 10 kilometers in some sectors, making infantry advances across open ground prohibitively costly. By using motorcycles and motorized vehicles to cross the kill zone at speed, Russian commanders were trying to move through the most dangerous ground before Ukrainian drone operators could acquire and engage them. The Ukrainian 16th Army Corps reported that the assault was repelled on that occasion, but the fact that Russia was adapting its tactics, finding new ways to cross the ground that Ukrainian drone defenses had made lethal, told you everything about the determination driving the North grouping's advance. The city of Kharkiv itself has been under sustained Russian fire throughout 2025 and 2026 in a campaign of strikes that has systematically targeted its civilian population, its infrastructure, and its will to endure. In January 2026, a Russian drone attack on the outskirts of Kharkiv killed 4 people and wounded 6, with one of the strikes directly hitting a medical facility for children, starting a fire inside a building designed to care for sick children. Kharkiv Mayor Ihor Terekov confirmed the strike on the children's medical facility. Russia denied intentionally targeting civilians, as it has denied every strike on every hospital and school and apartment building throughout the war, while continuing to conduct exactly those strikes. In February 2026, Russian forces launched 3 separate airstrikes on Kharkiv's Slobodskaya district in a single day, killing 1 person and injuring 11 more. In the same period, Russian forces struck 2 districts of Kharkiv city, the Shevchenkivsky and Kolodnohirsky districts, starting a fire at an infrastructure facility hit in the attack. The mayor of Kharkiv, Ihor Terekov, confirmed that a major critical energy infrastructure facility had been destroyed by a Russian strike, leaving portions of the city without power. The strike on Marifa, a town located just outside Kharkiv city on May 4, 2026, illustrated with particular brutality what Russia's campaign against this region actually means for the people living inside it. A Russian missile, assessed by Ukrainian officials as an Iskander-type ballistic missile, struck Marifa's civilian infrastructure in the middle of the morning. 6 people were killed immediately, more than 30 others were wounded. At least 10 houses and 4 shops were destroyed or severely damaged. Governor Oleh Syniehubov described it precisely. 2 men and 3 women were killed on the spot, and another man died from his wounds in hospital. The target struck in Marifa had no military significance. It was civilian infrastructure in a town located far from the front line, attacked in broad daylight with a weapon designed to destroy hardened military facilities. Russia said nothing about the Marifa strike. It never does. The pattern of attacking civilian areas with ballistic missiles and then maintaining official silence about the outcome has been consistent since the beginning of the full-scale invasion and shows no sign of changing. 2 people were killed in a separate Russian drone strike on Kharkiv city in the same period, adding to a casualty toll across the Kharkiv region that accumulates week by week in reports that each describe another dead civilian, another destroyed home, another family that no longer exists in its previous form. 6 people were killed in a Russian missile attack on Kharkiv in another strike. 4 people were killed in a further missile attack on Kharkiv in yet another strike within weeks of the first. These are not isolated incidents. They are the rhythm of this campaign, the steady drumbeat of attacks on Ukraine's second city and its surrounding region that has been playing without interruption since the North grouping began its advance. To understand why Russia has been able to advance in Kharkiv Oblast despite fierce Ukrainian resistance, you need to understand the resource mathematics that have defined this war since 2023. Ukraine's most critical shortage throughout 2025 and 2026 has been ammunition, and specifically artillery ammunition and air defense interceptors. Russia, operating a war economy that by 2025 was allocating roughly 40% of its federal budget to defense spending, has been producing artillery shells at a rate that Western analysts estimate at between 3 and 5 million rounds per year, more than the entire NATO alliance was producing combined at the beginning of 2024. Ukraine, dependent on ammunition supplies from allies whose own stockpiles were depleted after the massive transfers of 2022 and 2023, has faced persistent shortfalls that have forced Ukrainian commanders to ration artillery fire in ways that directly constrain their ability to defend positions under pressure. In northern Kharkiv Oblast, where Russian forces conduct up to 16 attacks per day, artillery rationing means that not every Russian probe can be met with the counter-battery fire that would make it prohibitively costly. Some attacks get through. Some positions become untenable. The line moves. Russia's aerial campaign against Kharkiv has also adapted in ways that directly respond to Ukrainian air defense capabilities. Russian forces have been increasingly leveraging the tactic of launching massive strikes in waves, using long-range drones and cruise missiles in the first wave to exhaust Ukrainian air defenses and force the consumption of interceptors, then following with ballistic missiles that Ukrainian forces struggle to intercept without Patriot systems that take minutes to reload after firing. The Ukrainian Air Force confirmed this pattern explicitly, noting that Russian strategic aviation had become more active in spring 2026, and that aircraft were being redeployed to distant airfields, suggesting preparation for new strike campaigns. The strike against Dnipro City in April 2026, that lasted more than 20 hours, and killed at least 6 civilians while injuring 47 others, was a direct application of this wave tactic, with Kharkiv also struck in the same attack sequence. Russian forces fired 659 drones and 44 missiles in the 24 hours before that Thursday morning strike, one of the largest single-day aerial attacks of the entire war, killing 18 people, including a child, and wounding 118 others across Ukraine. The buffer zone that Putin ordered, and that General Gerasimov confirmed was being expanded throughout 2026, is not simply a military objective. It is a doctrine. When Putin stated during a December 2025 meeting with his commanders that Russian forces were creating a security belt in the border areas of Sumy, Kharkiv, and Dnipropetrovsk regions at good speed, and praised the high tempo of the operation, he was articulating a strategic vision that extends beyond any single battle. The buffer zone doctrine says that Russia requires a band of Ukrainian territory under its military control deep enough to prevent Ukrainian artillery from reaching Russian border cities like Belgorod and Bryansk. But the geography of that requirement keeps expanding. General Gerasimov confirmed that the North grouping had by early 2026 seized approximately 950 square kilometers and 32 settlements across the Kharkiv and Sumy regions. That is not a defensive buffer. That is a platform for further operations, a forward position from which Russian artillery can now reach further into Ukrainian territory than it could from Russian border regions, a springboard that makes the next advance geometrically easier than the advance that preceded it. Ukrainian President Zelensky called Moscow's plans for Kharkiv and Sumy mad when Gerasimov's announcement was made public. He vowed they would be resisted. But the operational reality that Ukrainian commanders are dealing with in northern Kharkiv Oblast makes that resistance extraordinarily costly in both human and material terms. The Ukrainian 16th Army Corps, which holds the northern Kharkiv front, has been fighting continuously since the North grouping began its offensive in May 2024. The soldiers in those positions have endured more than a year of daily attacks, artillery fire, drone strikes, and infantry assaults without the kind of rotation and rest cycle that military doctrine recommends for combat effectiveness. The weapons they are using are aging, the ammunition they are consuming is being replaced more slowly than it is being expended, and the reinforcements available to them are drawn from a Ukrainian military that is simultaneously defending a 1,250-kilometer front line against Russian offensive pressure in multiple sectors at once. Russia's deployment of elements of at least one newly reformed military unit to the Kupiansk direction in February 2026, confirmed by intelligence assessments, indicated that Moscow was reinforcing the North grouping, rather than drawing down after 2 years of costly operations. Fresh formations, new equipment, new command structures being fed into an already active offensive front is the behavior of a military that believes its strategy is working and intends to press the advantage it has gained. The Kupiansk direction is the second main effort of the North grouping after the Vovchansk axis, with Russia's objective in that sector being to cross the Oskil River in Kharkiv Oblast and push westward into eastern Kharkiv Oblast and northern Donetsk Oblast, threatening Ukrainian supply lines and potentially encircling Ukrainian forces positioned along the river. Russian troops maintained a limited presence inside Kupiansk city itself by early 2026, continuing active attacks on Ukrainian positions at the bridgehead east of the Oskil River, while probing for the opportunity to cross and expand their foothold. The gray zone that has defined the front line in northern Kharkiv Oblast, the band of territory between Ukrainian and Russian positions where drone strike risk is elevated enough to make movement extremely dangerous, had expanded to as much as 10 kilometers in some sectors by spring 2026. That expansion is a direct consequence of the massive increase in FPV drone usage by both sides, with operators able to guide attack drones at speeds and with precision that make the traditional concept of a clearly defined front line obsolete. In its place is a zone of lethal uncertainty, where Russian fire teams moving toward Ukrainian positions and Ukrainian forces attempting to reinforce their own lines both face the constant threat of an FPV drone attack that can come from any direction at any moment. Ukrainian forces near Vovchansk responded to this environment by using fiber-optic drones, which cannot be jammed because they communicate through a physical cable rather than a radio signal, to extend their own kill zone into Belgorod Oblast itself, targeting Russian artillery positions across the border that would otherwise be out of reach. Russian commanders responded by installing anti-drone nets over their artillery to protect the guns from exactly this capability. The war of adaptations and counter-adaptations in the gray zone of northern Kharkiv Oblast is one of the most technically sophisticated and continuously evolving military competitions in modern warfare, and it is being fought in real time by exhausted soldiers on both sides. The humanitarian consequences of everything described above fall most heavily on the civilians who have not or cannot leave the Kharkiv region. The mandatory evacuations ordered by Governor Sinigubov in April 2026 for communities including Vovchansk and Kupiansk were the latest in a long series of displacement events that have progressively emptied the communities closest to the front. In Dnipropetrovsk Oblast, 44 settlements were subjected to mandatory evacuation due to the deteriorating security situation, affecting approximately 3,000 children and families. In the Kharkiv region, communities that had populations of thousands before the war now have populations of dozens, elderly residents who refuse to leave their homes regardless of the danger. People for whom the house they built or inherited represents a life that cannot simply be packed into a bag and carried to a shelter in a city they do not know. When Russian artillery fires on those communities, when Russian guided bombs fall on the villages along the buffer zone perimeter, those are the people being hit. An elderly man killed in Vovchansk, a woman found dead in Rubble, a 2-year-old child wounded in Marefa. These are not casualties of a military operation in any meaningful sense. They are the victims of a deliberate and sustained campaign to make Ukrainian territory north of Kharkiv uninhabitable. Ukraine has not accepted this advance passively. Ukrainian forces have used their expanding long-range strike capability to reach further and further into Russian territory to hit the logistics and industrial infrastructure that sustains the North Grouping's offensive. Ukrainian drones struck the Novokuybishevsk oil refinery in Samara Oblast, deep inside Russia. Ukrainian drones set fire to the Nevinomysk Azot chemical plant in Nevinomysk, Stavropol Oblast, for the 5th time since June 2025, targeting a facility that makes ingredients for explosives including TNT and RDX used by the Russian military. Ukrainian drones struck the Novocherkassk thermal power plant in Novocherkassk, Rostov Oblast, causing a regional power outage. The security service of Ukraine cooperated with the Ukrainian Navy to attack a Russian drone factory in Taganrog. By April 2026, Ukrainian drones were striking targets in Yekaterinburg and Chelyabinsk, roughly 1,600 to 1,700 kilometers from the Ukrainian border, the longest-range Ukrainian drone strikes of the entire war at that point. These strikes are not symbolic. They are targeting the industrial and energy infrastructure that feeds Russia's war economy, and they are reaching facilities that Russian air defenses have not been configured to protect, because they were never previously considered within Ukraine's strike range. The international dimension of Russia's Kharkiv offensive matters as well, because it is happening inside a diplomatic context that has consistently failed to produce the pressure needed to stop it. While ceasefire negotiations between Russia and Ukraine have been underway through American mediation, with President Trump's team pushing both sides toward a pause in hostilities, the North Grouping has not paused for a single day of its buffer zone expansion. When Russia declared its Victory Day ceasefire from May 9th to May 11th, 2026, and when the Trump-mediated 3-day truce went into effect, Russian forces continued conducting assaults along the Kharkiv front line, with the Ukrainian General Staff recording 45 combat engagements on the very first night of the American-brokered ceasefire. Ceasefires in this war have applied to drone strikes on city centers more than they have applied to infantry assaults along active frontline sectors. And the distinction matters enormously for the people of Vovchansk and Kupiansk and the villages of northern Kharkiv Oblast, who are on the receiving end of those assaults every day, regardless of what diplomats announce in foreign. Estonia's Foreign Intelligence Chief Kaupo Rosen assessed in February 2026 that Putin currently has no desire to halt the invasion of Ukraine and believes he can outsmart the United States in any peace negotiations. That assessment was based on intelligence gathered from Russian internal discussions, and it aligned precisely with what the North Grouping was doing in Kharkiv Oblast at exactly the same time Rosen was speaking. Russia was advancing, Russia was reinforcing, Russia was deploying newly reformed units to the Kupiansk direction, and Russia was conducting 15 to 16 attacks per day in the northern Kharkiv direction, while its diplomats discussed ceasefire parameters in Istanbul and Washington. The gap between what Russian officials say about peace and what Russian military commanders do on the ground in Kharkiv Oblast is not a contradiction. It is a strategy. Diplomacy buys time and political cover. The North Grouping uses that time to move the line. The People's Republic of China's role in sustaining Russia's ability to maintain the Kharkiv offensive has been confirmed by multiple intelligence assessments and deserves specific attention. American analysts and Ukrainian intelligence officials have consistently identified China as a critical enabler of Russia's war economy, supplying dual-use goods, electronic components, machine tools, and other materials that feed Russian military production. By February 2026, the Chinese government had issued a warning to Chinese citizens living in Russia about a Russian law compelling service in the Russian military, an indication that Moscow was considering coercing Chinese nationals in Russia into military service, a development alarming enough for the Chinese consulate to formally alert its own citizens about. The warning was also an indicator of how broadly Russia was casting its net for military manpower as the war entered its fourth year, drawing on every available source to sustain the forces conducting the Kharkiv offensive and dozens of other simultaneous operations along the 1,200-kilometer front. The Russian military's losses in the Kharkiv campaign have been severe by any conventional military accounting. Ukrainian President Zelensky announced in early 2026 that Ukrainian intelligence had obtained a classified Kremlin assessment of Russian casualties showing that 1,315,000 Russian soldiers had been killed or wounded in action since the start of the full-scale invasion in February 2022. Zelensky said Ukrainian intelligence assessed those figures were understated. Even taking the Kremlin's own internal numbers at face value, 1,315,000 casualties in 4 years of war represents a scale of human loss in Russian military ranks that would have been considered impossible to absorb for any Western military force. Yet Russia has absorbed it and continued advancing. The North grouping attacking Vovchansk for the 16th time in a day is doing so with soldiers drawn from a military that has lost over 1 million men. That tells you something fundamental about Russia's strategic calculus. The leadership in Moscow has decided that no level of casualties makes the war more costly than the alternative of accepting a Ukraine that is not under Russian control. But striking Russian factories 1,600 kilometers away, as strategically significant as it is, does not stop the North grouping from attacking Vovchansk for the 16th time in a single day. It does not replenish the Patriot interceptor missiles that Ukrainian air defenders in Kharkiv need to shoot down the ballistic missiles falling on the city. It does not rotate the exhausted soldiers of the Ukrainian 16th Army Corps who have been holding the northern Kharkiv front through more than a year of continuous combat. The strategic reach of Ukraine's long-range drone program and the tactical reality of the Kharkiv front line exist on different timelines, and Russia is exploiting the gap between them with patient, grinding daily pressure that accumulates into frontline changes visible on the maps that Ukrainian and Western analysts update every day. What the Kharkiv slaughter ultimately reveals about this war in 2026 is something that military historians will study for decades. It reveals what a modern military campaign looks like when one side has decided to treat human cost as a variable to be managed rather than a limit to be respected. When artillery and drones and missiles are used not to defeat an enemy military force, but to destroy the physical and psychological infrastructure of a civilian population living behind that military force. Kharkiv city has been struck repeatedly from a distance by weapons that Russia claims are not targeting civilians. The children's medical facility in Kharkiv's outskirts was hit by one of those weapons. The infrastructure facility that the mayor of Kharkiv confirmed was a major critical energy installation was hit by one of those weapons. The homes in Marefa, where 6 people died on a Monday morning, were hit by one of those weapons. The North grouping is not advancing toward Kharkiv city because it needs the city for military purposes. It is advancing toward Kharkiv city because putting Russian artillery within range of Ukraine's second-largest urban center, with its 1 million remaining residents, creates a form of permanent pressure on Ukraine's government and military that cannot be answered without forcing Russia back from the border entirely. And forcing Russia back from the border entirely is exactly what Ukraine has been trying and failing to do since May 2024. The front line has been redefined. Russia has drawn it with guns and drones and missiles and the bodies of Ukrainian civilians. And until the resource equation that sustains the North grouping's advance changes in ways that make each attack more costly to Russia than the last, the advance will continue. The strikes on Kharkiv will continue. And the slaughter that has redefined this front line will go on. The fiber-optic drone that reached Kharkiv city's outskirts on February 25, 2026, was not the end of anything. It was a marker. A measurement of how far the front had moved and how much further it can move if nothing changes. 1 million people live in Kharkiv. They are less than 30 kilometers from the Russian border. And the North grouping is still attacking every day, 15 to 16 times a day, moving toward them one probing assault at a time.